Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Canagita. I'm the Community Coordinator of the New South Wales Active MedTech Community. And welcome to our second webinar in our program. For those of you who only just joined recently, we launched this community last November, took a break over Christmas, and we're just starting up with the program of activities for the year. What we are intending to do is run a series of high-level webinars on topics that give a broad brush overview of the entire spectrum of active medical technology. Last week was that introductory topic, and the recording of that is available on our website. Today we're going to be tackling I guess probably the next really big topic, and that is the whole subject of regulatory requirements. And again, it'll be sort of a high-level view, and towards the second half of the year, we'll be having more detailed webinars on more niche topics within that. We will be running webinars roughly once every fortnight for the first 6 to 9 months until we've got through the program of top-level topics, and we've got a good repository of information on the website. And then we'll be reverting to monthly. Once a quarter, we'll be meeting face-to-face, and I have just put up on the website in the last few days our first quarterly meeting, which is on the 2nd of April, and that will be held in Macquarie Park at Venture Cafe. So go and check out the details of that. It'd be great to meet you all face-to-face. So I'd also like to acknowledge the sponsors, Genesis Electronics Design and CircuitWise Electronics Manufacturing, who are paying my way towards coordinating the community. Genesis and CircuitWise are both ISO 13485 certified. In Genesis' case, a designer, and CircuitWise's case, a manufacturer of medical devices. And just want to acknowledge their support. So it's my pleasure now. Oh, sorry, one more point before we move on is I would just encourage you all to start typing in questions during the webinar. You can see the icon should be at the bottom of your screen, and there's a little Q&A icon, so please click on that and type in your questions. I think you can also chat with each other if you wish. If you want to raise a virtual hand, I may be able to give you a mic if that's what you really want. And there's our contact details in the bottom right-hand corner if you don't already have them. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Heyam Kalla, who is a senior consultant with Brandwood CKC, and I'll hand over to Heyam to tell us all about regulatory requirements. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. So my name's Heyam Kalla, as Tim introduced me, and I'm a senior consultant here at Brandwood CKC, and I've been with Brandwood for 2.5 years now, and prior to that worked in the regulatory quality for a large multinational. Today I'll be talking to you about giving you a quick overview on regulatory, how do regulators regulate, definitions, 2 of the major regulatory models, which I'll go into a bit more detail on, quick on QMS, and a summary. So this is a very kind of high level overview on the 2 major parts of regulatory when it comes to medical devices. So the pre-market phase, which is all that beginning stuff that you guys will have to do to get an approval to get a device onto market, which I'll go into much more detail now. And then the second phase to that is post-market. So once the device is onto market, all that compliance stuff that needs to happen to ensure that the device remains compliant. So the first thing is a quick definition on what is a medical device. This is really important because for something to be a medical device, it's all about that intended purpose. And I'll use the word intended purpose quite a lot during this presentation because it's absolutely vital, and it really dictates kind of the work that's required and the classification and everything that would be required to get your device onto market. The key things is if it's intended to diagnose, intended to treat, basically anything where the intended purpose involves health and medical care. So it's, yeah, so this is kind of that overview on.
Heyam, can I jump in and ask a question here? I'm just interested in knowing, are there cases where it's really not clear whether it's a medical device? Because at Genesis and Circlewise, I know people come in all the time, and one of the first questions they ask, well, is it a medical device or not? And we said, generally say, look, you've got to go and see a regulatory consultant to get a professional opinion. What makes it so difficult to really know whether something is actually a medical device? Is there a grey area at all?
Yes, I would say it does become difficult, especially when we're talking about software applications, because there is a kind of a blurry line between, oh no, it's not a medical device, I'm just, you know, not giving information onto consumers, you know, related to medical. I'm just giving them a link to a website or something like that. Whereas other software may specifically result in something where the consumer may make a decision on their healthcare and that kind of thing. So that's where it comes to that intended purpose. What is the purpose of that device, and does it fall within that definition? And look, there probably is grey area, but there's always that conclusion as to whether or not it's a medical device.
And my second question, so audience, do please forgive me as a facilitator asking questions on your behalf, but do you ever see clients who go through the, well, do you ever see companies who develop devices thinking that they're not a medical device, get to the end and suddenly realise, holy cow, it is a medical device? Yes. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, and that's why it's really important to consider these things at the beginning and to incorporate your regulatory at the very beginning of your design and development. And if it's on the borderline and you are questioning that, then it's better to ask the questions early and kind of get it clarified, because the other problem is if it is on that borderline, it may tip over into into a medical device. And if you've got that clarity early, then it will definitely save you time and money.
Thank you.
I also included a slide on what an active medical device is, just because you guys all deal with active devices. And I've included the definitions. This is specific to the TGA regulations. And I've included it because it's important to look at these definitions, because definitions do assist in determining your classification and, and the kind of device it is. So yeah, it's very important to kind of be aware of the different kinds of active medical devices as well, and how the TGA use them.
But obviously anything with electronics or software involved and a power source, or the electrical power source, is going to be an active device.
It is, yeah. And I think the key thing is whether or not it's for diagnosis, treatment, or if it's implantable, because different classification rules will apply based on that.
Sure, and we're going to hear all about that very shortly.
I also included software because, as we spoke just earlier, it's a very kind of blurry subject, and the increase of software devices that are out on the market now, and especially with iPhone applications and that kind of thing, the regulators are now starting to catch up, I guess, with the current environment. The key thing again, of course, is whether or not it is a medical device, and that's why that the definition and the intended purpose is again extremely important. So I think I've written at the bottom of that slide, always evaluate for medical device classification. So always consider if it's a medical device, and particularly if you're not sure, get that advice early. It will save you a lot of time and money.
Okay.
So this is a very brief slide on the difference between a medical device software and a standalone software as a medical device. So I guess the key thing here is that, and this is more of the traditional sense, medical device software are those embedded into hardware. So computers or programmers which program pacemakers, and they may communicate with the device via Bluetooth or via cord. You know, they're kind of the traditional medical device softwares. And then you've also got the standalone software, which is, you know, the applications and the, you know, web-based apps and that kind of thing. So this is just to really define between the differences between them and how that may be, you may see these come up in the regulatory environment. So it's good to kind of know the differences. So as mentioned in the agenda slide, there are two regulatory models that I will be talking to you guys about today. The first is the GHTF model. GHTF is the Global Harmonization Task Force, which was a group that involved many countries and their regulatory representatives, and basically tried to, their goal was to harmonize regulatory across, you know, around the world. This group has now, doesn't exist anymore, they've disbanded, and it's now known as the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. But it's still called the GHTF model, as they were kind of the original group that kind of organized this. Now this is, so Europe and Australia fall within this. So, and that's why you will see that Europe and Australia does share a lot of the regulatory requirements, and there is a bit of overlap here. So the key things with the GHTF model is that it's a rules-based classification, which is directly involves risk. So the more riskier the device, the higher the classification. And once again, the intended purpose is how you determine your device classification. So, you know, if a device is intended to be implanted and, you know, support life like a pacemaker, then it's going to be a higher classification to perhaps something that's, you know, a blood pressure monitor or something like that, which will have a lower classification. And your classification determines the amount of work or the amount of the scrutiny that your device will be looked at. Another aspect to this is the essential requirements. This is also known as the essential principles in Australia. And these are, I'll go into a bit more detail about them later, but this is a very fundamental part of this model. You know, there's a tech file involved, which I'll also go into, and post-market vigilance, which, you know, is that recalls and complaint side of things.
So this looks like one of these quizzes you see in a pub. I'm just looking at the flag in the top left-hand corner in that, and I know I should probably know what it is. I'm guessing here.
That's Europe.
That's Europe, is it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I would have guessed wrong, actually. So my big question
is probably inaccurate now because of Britain. But
and I can see that, you know, we've got Japan and Canada there, but what about China? Where does China fit?
China is a lone wolf.
China's a lone wolf.
Yeah, China
like the United States.
Like the United States. At least the United States, I feel, is a little bit more friendly. China is a little bit, yeah, they've got their very own kind of way of doing things.
Okay.
So,
are there any other big countries that we should know of that your clients typically want to get registration in?
They're probably the major ones, because once you get into Europe or you get USA, most of the time it does allow you to get into those other countries or those smaller kind of jurisdictions.
So countries like, you know, Indonesia and India, for that matter, you know, huge countries in their own right.
Yes, and well, another issue is that some countries such as India and Indonesia, their regulatory systems are a little bit kind of premature and they're quite young, especially India. Like their medical devices have, I think, recently changed, and so I think it's good to kind of do your research and figure out the best way and the best strategy, because if getting Europe or a USA approval allows you to get into the other countries, then that may be the better way to go, rather than try to get into India first and then go into the other countries. So yeah. I think it depends on the priorities and what the business strategy is.
And I've noticed a growing trend, particularly amongst startups, to really want to sort of change the world and have products that are targeted specifically at third world countries. Like, for example, I saw one recently about trying to diagnose tuberculosis in, you know, in under a minute using a particular device. And it was very specifically targeted at third world countries that didn't have that infrastructure, laboratory infrastructure. If somebody was trying to target third world countries, you know, what would your advice to them be?
Oh, I don't know. I think, still, I would always say to make sure you do your research first and understand the regulatory environment and think about it early in that process, because it's much easier to address the regulatory and quality requirements at the beginning of the process, or at least towards the beginning of the process, than at the end. So do your research and do it early.
Yeah, okay. So moving on then.
So this is a quick overview of the Australian kind of landscape. To the left is clinical trials, special access and personal imports. These pathways do not require regulatory approval, but do require notification of some sort to the TGA. So personal imports, of course, is, you know, someone can get a device from, say, another country that's not approved in Australia, get it sent to them personally and use it for their personal use. They're taking that risk upon themselves. So that kind of falls into the personal imports category. Special access is a way for surgeons to get access to medical devices that are not approved in Australia. And clinical trials, self-explanatory. You know, if you're bringing devices in for trials, then these are the pathways you'd look at. To the right is pathways, or I guess devices that must meet performance requirements. So custom-made devices at the moment do not need to be assessed by the TGA. However, they do need to still comply with safety and performance. And exempt goods, so, you know, which are things like bed sheets and maybe toothpaste and that kind of thing, obviously don't need to be assessed by the TGA, as they pose very, very, very minimal risk. And then ARTG inclusion is the registration process. So when you want to get your device approved, this would be the process that you would kind of follow. And, you know, in Australia, we have 4 classifications. So class 1, which is the lowest risk, class 2A, class 2B, class 3, and then AIMD, which stands for active implantable medical device. So, and then, as you can see, the amount of work required increases as you go up in the classification. IVD is also there. IVD is in vitro diagnostic, which are things like pregnancy tests and urine tests of some sort. So they are also classified in 4 tiers, and you can see that their risk increases the higher classification it goes.
And it's worth pointing out there for any newcomers in vitro, I understand, it is literally the translation is in glass. So
yeah, so it's basically like if you take a sample out of the body and use a device to give you a diagnosis of some sort.
Yeah, so that's come from a sample coming out, putting in a glass test tube or something, and whereas in vivo is in body.
Yeah,
I understand.
Yeah. So in vitro, out of the body. So blood samples, urine samples, anything like that.
Okay.
So this is the current TGA process. Until about 1.5 years ago was the only way you could get an ARTG in Australia. So there's the risk to the left, as you can see, increasing risk, the more work required. So a class 1, that's a self-notification or a notification to the TGA. There is no sort of regulatory review required.
Can I just pause there on that? Can you give an example of what a class 1 device might look like, and why doesn't it need to go through some sort of?
Well, it would be the absolute lowest risk. So if we think about a reusable, or let's use an active, so a cable that literally plugs into the wall and connects to a medical device that provides the power, that may be considered a class 1 medical device. Another example is a reusable surgical instrument such as a scalpel. There's not too much risk associated with that. So the TGA just requires that you, and then it's very limited. There are there are a very limited number of devices that fall within that. So, you know, if reusable devices and those, that pose minimal risk. There is class 1S sterile and class 1M measuring, and that again increases the risk, and you do need to provide conformity assessment. So evidence that the device or that the manufacturer has been assessed for that device in order to get an ARTG.
Okay, thank you.
So you can see the 1S, 1M there, class 2A and class 2B, they need that. So that CE is the European EC certificate. So the TGA accepts a European certification to support your, getting your ARTG approval here. If you don't have a European approval, then you can use the TGA process, which is almost identical. It's just that the TGA does that assessment and provides you the certification as opposed to a European notified body. On top of that, you have...
Sorry, just because I know we've got a new audience here. What's a notified body?
A notified body is a European, they're basically European, or doesn't have to be European, but organizations which do an assessment on your quality and your device in order to, to the European regulations, which is done by the European Commission. So the European Commission sets the rules and regulations. A notified body will assess you to those rules and regulations and provide you the certification so that you are able to, get market access in Europe. In addition to that, each country has a competent authority, which is similar to the TGA in that they look after the medical devices within their country. And, if something comes up, then they are aware. So Europe is a bit confusing because there's kind of three major parties, whereas in Australia, it's the TGA. So the TGA acts as the regulatory body. The TGA sets the rules, the legislation, and the TGA can also be a notified body and actually do your assessment and your certification.
Okay, can you just give me a couple of examples of the big notified bodies in Europe?
BSI.
Yes.
That's the big one.
Are they still in Europe?
They are, yes. So BSI and TÜV-SÜD, all the major players are still currently playing. At the moment, Europe is undergoing a major regulatory change. So the European Commission has set new regulations, and some notified bodies have pulled out because they don't want to be redesignated. Okay. But BSI is still playing, so.
Okay.
We can go to the next page, I think. So on top of utilising the European approval to get an ARTG in Australia, you can also now utilise your USA approval, your Canada approval, or your Japan approval. So this is a recent introduction, and so these approvals are used in conjunction with your MDSAP certificate, which provides that QMS, your QMS kind of certification. So there's always kind of two stages with the TGA and with all regulatory. There's that QMS component, which looks at your manufacturing and your quality management system, and then the actual product assessment. And that's, that's basically where it is across the board. And this kind of summarized here for Australia to get your ARTG. So you can use Europe, TGA, USA, Canada, or Japan to get an ARTG and to get selling in Australia.
And these names I'm seeing up here, Shonin and Ninsho?
So they are just so Australia has the ARTG, Japan has Shonin and Ninsho. Just refers to their approval or their certificate names. So Europe, as you can see, it's quite similar to Australia. You classify the device, and that then determines, the level of sort of work required. To the left is the class 1. Similar to Australia, it's also a self-certification. And, once it reaches that 1S, so sterile measuring, 2A, 2B, or 3, then that's when you need to get a notified body involved and get your CE certificate, which is your approval, and then be able to get market access into Europe. So just a quick rundown For Europe, the good thing is it is common across the European countries. So that's always a positive. So you don't have to go for Germany and Italy and all that, just have to do the one process. There are still some country specific considerations. So obviously language, need to be mindful of that, you know, ensuring that your labeling does accommodate for the different languages within Europe. Conformity assessment procedures carried out by the notified body. So as we said before, they are the ones that will assess you so that you can, you know, get your certification and therefore market access. CE marking of device upon, yeah, that's basically that. And local representation required. So this is a authorized representative. So this is similar to Australia. Australia requires a local sponsor. So basically someone who is local. So it can't be a, you know, if you say you're based in Australia and you want to get into Europe, you can't be your authorized representative. It needs to be someone local, and that entity is legally responsible for that registration. And, you know, if there's a recall or anything like that involved, then they're the ones that will be contacted. So that's really important to consider, especially when you're planning on kind of going into other markets.
So can I just pause there, because I do have another question on this. At Genesis, I know that what happens quite often is you'll get clients coming in who want a medical device developed to use for themselves. And so a typical scenario for us is a chain of cosmetic stores, for example.
Yep.
And they might have enough volume to use in their own stores, but then they're thinking, well, maybe I can sell to somebody else. But they don't want to become a certified medical manufacturer. And they often ask the question, can we get one of these local representatives to be the 13485 sort of certified person in the company? I'm pretty sure I know what the answer to this is, but can you just talk, just talk me through that scenario?
Completely separate. So a local rep is more looks after things after you get your approval. So is not responsible. So the legal manufacturer is that in which will receive the approval. So your QMS certification and your kind of device approval will be based on the information from the legal manufacturer, whereas the authorized rep or sponsor, once you will get an approval for the device and then be responsible for recalls or post-market. And that's still in conjunction with the legal manufacturer. The legal manufacturer is ultimately the most,
so in short, should
be the most responsible of them all. And yeah, unfortunately, if you choose to be a legal manufacturer, then you must get your certification and all that.
In short, there's no easy way around that.
There's no easy way around it. And particularly, I guess in this time when we've got 3D printing and everything like that, these questions have started to come up where, okay, are they manufacturing? That's why you get your advice early.
Are they manufacturing? Maybe we'll explore that in the end. We'll move on with the webinar.
Yeah, and so general safety and performance requirements. These, as I mentioned just a little bit earlier, I'll talk about it a little bit later, but essentially because Europe has now changed or is in the process of changing from the MDD, which is the Medical Device Directive, to the MDR, which is the Medical Device Regulations. These essential requirements have now changed to general safety and performance requirements. They mean essentially the same thing, it's just that they've changed the wording. So I just wanted to point that out because in the next few slides, we'll be talking a little bit about that. And this MDD to MDR is definitely a current challenge with Europe at the moment, and particularly, and of course the UK exiting means that, you know, what was once a European approval to get access to both Europe and the UK, now that needs to kind of be reconsidered. And this may not be clear on that pathway until the UK gets all their agreements and all of that in place. So it's a hot topic at the moment. And yeah, the last point with the notified bodies needing to be redesignated under MDR, there's a lot of delays with that. So yeah, it's still kind of up in the air and a big work in progress. So technical file, this is a, basically it's a collection or Yeah, I guess a collection of documents that each device or group of devices must have, and it is used as evidence to ensure that your device meets the regulations or complies with the regulations. There's two bold items there, risk management file and essential requirements, which is what I'll go into a little bit more depth, and they're quite huge components of this. Another one is that clinical evidence. So the clinical evaluation report is another big component of this. And each device, no matter what classification, will need to have a tech file. The level of detail within that will depend on the classification. So the riskier the device, the more data you need.
Can I just ask a question about this? Because we often hear that the regulatory process can be quite burdensome, and it's a large part of the project. Is it just because of the volume of documentation that makes it such a arduous route, part of development of a project?
Yeah, there's a lot of documentation, and there's a lot of requirements and different things that need to be considered to make up this documentation. So I think it's burdensome in the sense of there's just so much more involved, and I think that is because, it is a medical device, it is going to be going into someone, or someone will be using it. So there's just a lot more involved to ensure that, the safety and performance of that device is demonstrated.
Yeah. So in a typical, say, Class 2B device, we are looking at what, is it tens of thousands of pages of documentation? Are we talking about?
Well, I guess that's hard to say because you've got your QMS, and that would be a separate sort of component, and then your tech file, and I think that would just depend on the specifications, or I mean, if it's a software, there's probably a lot less documentation than, say, if it's a device that has multiple components and multiple kind of attributes to it, and if it's an implantable 2B versus a not implantable 2B. So it really depends on all that. So most of the time, this is all gathered from things that will need to be done anyway and kind of put together. So it may seem like a lot of, it is a lot of documents, but it does make sense, I think, when you look at it from the regulatory perspective.
Yeah, I get the impression, because it's very similar in the electronics design side of things, is that it's actually just, it's not actually that hard. It's just, you just got to be rigorous and systematic about
exactly,
it.
Yeah.
And you'll get there eventually.
And that's exactly it. So that's definitely, you could sum up reg and quality. It's very much like just following the rules and just gathering things as you go, and just, if you plan for it early, then it's pretty achievable.
Thank you.
So essential principles, also known as the essential requirements and the general safety and performance requirements, just to confuse everyone. It is essentially a list of requirements that is intended to basically ensure that the device meets safety and performance, or safety and efficacy endpoints. So the essential principles is the Australian kind of version of this, which is what I've included in these particular slide sets. And it is very common amongst the different jurisdictions, here in Europe. So if you can comply with one, then generally you're complying with both. So EP1, EP2, very much about safety, and one of the key ways to ensure compliance with your essential principles is through the use of harmonized standards, which we'll go into a bit more depth in the next few slides. As the primary endpoint here is safety, I just wanted to point out that, which is in the next slide, ensuring that your device is safe, this can be demonstrated through your risk management file. So that ties into one of the key aspects of your tech file. The harmonized standard ISO 14971 is what regulators expect that you would be compliant with, and that is basically a process that the manufacturer would follow in order to make sure that all the hazards have been identified and mitigated. this should be included, or you should start looking at your risk management very early in that product development lifestyle, because it definitely feeds into, you know, your design and development and then those end stages. So it's a very important standard, which is why I've given it a slide. So yeah, that's really important, and it does ensure you're complying with their essential principles. These are a few more essential principles. So you can see that, you know, most of it makes sense. I mean, you've got sterilization, you know, lifetime stuff, the properties, all of these are, you know, are requirements that all devices must comply with. If it's something that doesn't apply to your device, that's fine. You can just say it doesn't apply. For example, if your device doesn't have a measuring function, then EP10 wouldn't apply to yours. EP12 is the one I'm going to point out, because that's for your powered devices. So that's an important EP for you guys.
I guess down the track, I mentioned with this community, we'll be delving into even more detail as time goes by. So probably in about 2 years' time, you can expect to see a webinar on labelling and claims and so on and so forth. But yeah, there's a lot under the hood of all of these.
So this is, like I said before, one of the best ways, or a really good way to show that you are complying with the EPs is through the use of harmonized standards. EP12 once again is circled here, and so I'm sure you're all familiar or will be familiar with 6601 and potentially 62304. These are standards that should be considered, I think, when you're in that design and development phase and you're looking at the regulatory side of things. So very, very quick overview of ISO or IEC, sorry, 6601. This is a huge standard, I think. There are the general requirements, collateral standards, which you know, address different aspects, such as usability, such as labeling, and then you have particular standards, and that's referring to particular technology and device, and is very device specific. So you got like your ECG, there's one on X-ray, there's one on blood pressure. So this gives you a quick overview of the general, you know, the general standards, so part one. And I just wanted to highlight that it incorporates the risk management, you know, ISO 14971. So that ISO standard does really reach out into multiple areas of your regulatory. The other one, so 62304, this is another important one to consider, particularly when you're looking at software. It applies to all classifications of medical device software, including standalone software. So it's a really good one to consider. And within that, it actually has different sort of software classes. And this will also help determine deliverables on which sort of aspects of the standard applies. Now, this is a process standard, and you will see that it will map to ISO 13485, which is the QMS standard, and ISO 14971, so that risk management one. So it's yeah, it's a big one. So I just wanted to point out as well that, you know, although the GHTF model has the similar processes, you know, Europe, Australia, there are a few things that are different. So like I said before, there's the essential principles checklist. So the principles is Australian, the requirements is Europe, or the general safety and performance requirements. The classifications, so something that's classed as a 2A in Australia may not be in Europe, or vice versa. So it's really important to, you know, to look into that. Don't assume that it's the same. Declaration of conformity, which is a document as part of your tech file. There is a European version and an Australian version, and then your clinical evidence. So there are a few differences between Australia and Europe. So you can definitely cover your jurisdictions in the one tech file, or in the one sort of, you know, there's so much that overlap, but it's really important to keep in mind that there are differences among them. So the second regulatory model is the USA. Of course, they're a little bit different. So the major difference, I think, with the US and the GHTF model is that while the GHTF is all about the risk base, and that's how you determine your classification, in the US, it's about what the device is. So if it's a blood pressure monitor, then you look at what a blood pressure monitor is. It gives you a product code, or which is basically an identifier, and then that will tell you what regulations or the pathway that you would apply to that device. So yeah, it's a little bit different, but ultimately, you know, you're getting the same result. An overlapping fact is the post-market vigilance. So, you know, the US FDA still looks at recalls and your complaints data. So this is a quick overview. So there's 3 classifications in the US. So class 1, similar to GHTF, it is a self-assessment and it's just a listing. So although, you know, you don't need to go through that apply and approval process, or it doesn't get reviewed and that kind of thing. So there's no pre-market review. Class 2A, this is, you know, where you get that 510K, which I'm sure most of you have heard about. Whereas class 3, sorry.
Well, let's not assume that people have heard about it. What is a 510K?
A 510K is, that clearance is basically your approval for the US if you go via this pathway.
It's a pretty big deal getting through that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a big document for that process. So, but it is, let's say that's the easier process than if you had to do a PMA, which is the last one on the list there, which is for the higher risk or the devices which require more clinical data and that kind of thing. So I guess it's very similar across the world, where, you know, different classifications will determine the amount of work or the level of depth required for each approval process. I've included this slide because I thought it was a good, just a comparison between the 2 kind of major models. So like I said before, you know, GHTF is all about risk, and it is a rules-based classification, which comes from your intended purpose, whereas the US is sort of product code, which is, what is your device? This is the product code that is relevant to your device, and this is the work that is required. GHTF is all about your essential requirements and meeting those, using standards as a means of compliance, and having a tech file. Whereas the US is a little bit different, where you've got, you know, if you go through that 510K process, you need to have all the required bits of that 510K and present that as a data package to the US FDA. Both jurisdictions do require a local rep, so you do need to have, you know, someone locally in the USA to get your device there.
Sorry, I might have missed this earlier, but predication?
Yeah, so predication refers, so if you go via the 510K process, basically you will use the predication, which is a device that is identified as the predicate, or a device that is substantially equivalent. And you will say this device is the same as this device, so another device that has a 510K, and therefore that if your device is the same as that, then it's safe and you're able to get a 510K. It's much more, there's much more depth to that, but essentially that's what it is. So it relies on a previous iteration of that device, or a device that's similar.
Okay.
I included QMS because it's a huge part of regulatory. Basically, your quality management system is one of the very first kind of steps of getting your regulatory process and regulatory approval. And the level of quality management system does depend on the classification of your device again. So for a class 1, you may not need to be ISO 13485 certified. However, you still need to kind of meet various aspects of that QMS. So it's important to look at this quite early. And that does lead me into this, which is, yeah, so if it's considered very early in your design and development that it does make, it actually very much feeds into every stage of that process and is, you know, from very beginning to that, you know, inception stage. And then of course, once you've released the product and your post-market, so everything connects back to QMS. So definitely important to start thinking about it early.
I think it's worth reiterating something that we said in the last webinar, and probably will say in most webinars, is that there's certain things you can't do retrospectively. So if halfway down the track you decide, oh, actually it is a medical device, you may have to go back to the beginning and start all over again with all the documentation.
Yeah, it's definitely much more work to go backwards than it is to go forwards, I guess. So this is just a quick summary. So basically, to summarize, you know, so regardless if it's an active device, I guess, or if it's a standard device, or if it's a software, all the regulatory processes and pathways and requirements applies. It's just that, you know, it's there'll be certain things that will be specific to whether or not it's an active or not, such as that EP12. It's really, really important to incorporate regulatory and quality in the beginning, early. And, you know, obviously there is overlap in the regulatory requirements around the world, but there are differences per jurisdiction. So it's really important to think about where you want to go, and so that you can plan and organize things to get there.
Perfect. And so we've got to the end of the presentation. And just for those who joined late, my name is Tim Canagita. I am the coordinator of the New South Wales Active MedTech community, and you can see my contact details in the bottom right-hand corner there. And we've been listening to Heyam Kalla, a senior consultant with Brandwood CKC, on regulatory requirements for active MedTech. So I just like to remind everyone and ask them to type in your questions. If possible, you can see the little icon there. I think it's at the bottom of your screen. Just find that little Q&A icon and just type in your questions. If you could do that now, so we can get going. And if you want to contact Heyam or anyone from Brandwood with a specific question, just send it along to that email address you can see on the screen there, help@Brandwood CKC. So I'm just going to quickly ask Heyam a couple of questions that I had in mind here. I'm just really interested in the technical file, because that's obviously kind of, I guess, the major output of this whole regulatory process. To what extent do the technical developers, like the electronics designers, the industrial designers, so on and so forth, to what extent do they build the technical file versus a regulatory consultant? What's the interplay between those groups? And can you give tips for how that goes well, and maybe warnings about what not to do? So, yeah.
Look, I think, you know, technical file, there are aspects that, you know, the engineers will need to do, and then there are aspects that regulatory or clinical will need to do. And I think the major thing is that it is a interdisciplinary sort of process, and everyone must be involved, and you need to talk to each other. I think the warnings are when you know, one group doesn't listen to the other group, and you know, that can cause so many problems, but that's like any other project. So the regulatory kind of side of things, they bring what the regulatory requires, whereas, you know, the engineers bring that technical, you know, the technical sort of knowledge, and it must be kind of a work together process. Otherwise, it's just going to take too long, and you're probably not going to get too far if you don't kind of work together.
Great. I've got a question from Winston Wu here, and he asks, is data collection device from the medical device a medical device? That's a bit of a mouthful. Let's see if we can get the head around that. The data collection device does not provide a medical purpose. It's more for data traceability.
So the key thing is that it does not provide a medical purpose. So, no. It's all about what the purpose of that data collection is. If that data will be collected and then, go through, say it's analysed or assessed, and it provides a diagnosis or an output of some sort that maybe a clinician or a consumer is then going to make a decision on, then it's probably a medical device. But if it's just collecting data and that's it basically, then it's not. But, it's got to be assessed as a case-by-case basis and, really looking into what the purpose is.
Got a question from Jeff here. Can you please describe how the medical device single audit program fits in?
So the MDSAP is a QMS certification. It's pretty much ISO 13485 with consideration of the jurisdiction regulatory requirements. So it will be ISO 13485 and will include Australia, Brazil, US, Japan and Canada, and have different regulatory requirements for those, and that will incorporate into that MDSAP certificate and provide you that QMS certification. In Canada, this is mandatory. So if you want to get into Canada, then you must have an MDSAP certificate as your QMS certification. Whereas, for example, in Australia, we accept the MDSAP certificate, but also accept a QMS certification from a notified body or Australia. So it is just another form of a QMS certificate, and it is starting to kind of pick up ground because it does incorporate the regulatory requirements of those specific jurisdictions.
Okay, just got a question here about the use of, it's really more related to the QMS. Can a medical manufacturer, i.e. the product sponsor, rely on its supplier systems to fulfill its regulatory related quality obligations, e.g. the traceability of components by the electronics manufacturer?
So the important thing is who is the legal manufacturer. So the legal manufacturer doesn't actually have to do any manufacturing, but as the legal manufacturer, they are the ones that need to be certified, and they are the ones that need to ensure that their suppliers all meet that requirement and comply within their systems. So yeah, it's possible. It just, but it doesn't mean that responsibility is kind of put to them and not onto the legal manufacturer. The legal manufacturer is still responsible. Okay.
Rawi Khan asks, is the definition of a medical device common across the US, EU, ANZ and the rest of the world? I think you sort of, have you already addressed that? Or?
Yeah, essentially, yes. There's not too much difference between what a medical device is. It's all about that diagnosis, prevention, treatment, of human beings, essentially.
Okay. Jeff asks again, this is Jeff Sizer, actually, who presented last week and is one of the sponsors of the community. There is a need to recognise the difference between the technical file / medical device file and the 510K submission, which is much briefer in terms of its technical and other content. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so the technical file is definitely much bigger than the 510K. Technical file is something that is, European, Australian, they're the ones that really use that technical file. For the US 510K, they have a very specific contents that is required for that submission, and it is much briefer. There'll be aspects of the tech file that will be inputted, but they are separate, separate regulatory kind of sections or aspects, and they should be treated separately. And the 510K is much smaller because it is just that approval for the US, and you are specifically putting information together to address the 510K, whereas a tech file does have those multiple components to it.
So just coming back to if you're trying to get your product certified in multiple countries, both in those two different models, the US and the rest of the world, and even China for that matter, as you said, a lone wolf or third world countries, as we discussed earlier. What can you do to really streamline the process? I'm assuming having a single technical file, but then what can you do to make it easier to get your product certified in one country and then just roll it out around the world?
I would say the big thing would be to plan early. So to understand which jurisdictions you want to get into, which jurisdictions are the priority, and then, work your documentation, work your data towards that. And then if the plan is to get into all those countries in the one hit, then you need to make sure that you're addressing all the requirements within that. There's definitely overlap. I mean, you will have overlap between the different countries, but each country may have something specific to them, and you need to ensure that that's captured. There isn't really kind of a quicker way, but something to do bear in mind is that some of those countries will accept an approval from one of these major countries, such as a European approval or a US approval.
Okay. I was fascinated by a comment you made during the course of the presentation when you said, I think it was in reference to 3D printing, and you said, are they actually manufacturing? That sounds like another topic for another whole webinar, but can you give us a sort of a sneak preview on?
Oh, I mean, I guess that the, 3D printing is if you're creating a device that's going to go into someone or someone will be used, then that is considered a medical device. And I think because it's kind of a new technology, this was something that people are, I'm just 3D printing it, I'm not making a medical device. But once again, it's about the intended purpose. So what is the purpose of that device? And jurisdictions around the world, similar to how software has come up more recently, 3D printing is among that. So it's basically regulators and governments trying to catch up with the technology and ensuring that the regulatory sort of requirements, everything captures all those different types of technologies, such as the software apps and 3D printed devices.
So Mike is asking the question, what / if any are the certification requirements for software that controls the device, i.e. it's an integral part of the functioning of the device? And just for those who, what we're trying to do, get people familiar with the lingo, is what Mike's referring to there really is what we would normally call the firmware. So this is software that's actually embedded in the electronics on the device itself, as opposed to something that's up in the cloud or, further. So can you talk about that?
So it's a medical device. So it needs to be, so if it's supplied with the device, then it could be that the whole unit is a medical device, firmware and hardware included, and that would go through that registration process. If it's something where the software is, installed, they're ultimately going to be treated the same, whether or not it's a firmware that is installed onto some sort of device or if it's already embedded. Both are medical devices and both will go through that same process. It's all about what they're going to do, what their intended purpose is, and then determining classification, and then that will help determine, okay, which route would you go through to get certification.
Okay. And looks like we've got time for one more question, because I am trying to finish up sharp at 1 o'clock. And the last question is, I would like to know about the regulatory requirements around AI-based digital health apps for clinical decision support / diagnostic decision support. Artificial intelligence, is that one of those areas where the regulations are still trying to catch up, or is it clear cut?
Nothing's ever clear cut, no. No, it's still a software. It still does a clinical decision or a diagnostic. It is a medical device, and it's the same as any other kind of medical device. It must follow the requirements of a medical device. So you would still need to ensure that you have, all the, required processes and documentations in place so that you can get approval. The differences, I guess, between, a physical device and maybe a software such as the AI is that, they don't have that manufacturing component to it because it's kind of all digital. And that just means that different parts of the QMS and maybe different documents will be required for that, but it's still you know, if it's a medical device, it's a medical device, no matter how it is a medical device, you know, if it's a software or not. So.
And I'm just imagining, I'm thinking out loud here that AI it's not a rules-based system. It's sort of a learning system, machine intelligence machine learning, for example. So there'd be you still have to go through the whole risk assessment, you know, the risk of it giving a false recommendation or an erroneous one.
More difficult, I think. And it's still, I do agree, like it's a bit of a new, you know, a new technology, and we may, you know, the TGA or you know, other regulatory bodies may need a bit of time to kind of catch up with that. But at the moment, it's considered a medical device, and yeah, you will need to do your, you know, your risk assessment according to that, and to the risk. And
I'm going to take a note of this, because I think this could be a whole webinar topic, because I can just see all the question marks around, you know, the device that is, you know, I guess, you know, learning and adapting and changing and so forth.
Those are some interesting.
But we don't want to hold back the power of this technology. So I guess the final question around that is, do you feel that our current regulatory environment is encouraging the use of these advanced technologies or inhibiting them? It's probably an unfair, challenging question to end the webinar with.
I think it's. I think they are catching up to those technologies, but I do think that it's not prohibiting people having access to them. I think it's kind of, there's always ways, you know, especially if it's benefiting people. I do think regulators at the end of the day, you know, want people to have access to those technologies. But yeah, sometimes the legislation may take a while.
Okay, look, I'd encourage anybody out there, that was an anonymous person posting there. Oops. Screen sharing has stopped because the external display is disconnected. Sorry about that. I'm just going to try and bring up the screen again. I obviously bumped something here, and we'll try and get this back online. Hopefully you're seeing that there. Okay, so I just want to quickly raise awareness there of the upcoming events. So we do have, the next week is obtaining grants. So we're going to talk about funding, which is always uppermost in the mind of most of our clients. And then we're going to move to a fortnightly program. We're going to go back into the software electronics field and do a bit of a deep dive into some aspects of that. And then we alluded to the importance of quality systems. We're going to look at those in more detail. And I really would encourage everyone listening to come along to our quarterly networking meeting. It's a fantastic venue. There's free beer, wine, pizza if the quality of our presentations is not enough. Actually, we don't have presentations there. We run something called MedTech Hypotheticals, which is much more interactive. So I encourage you to get along to that. So that is the end of our presentation. So I just want to thank you, Heyam, for presenting today, and to the audience for attending. We doubled our number of attendees from our first webinar last week, so we're really pleased about that. And I just want to encourage everyone, if you're finding these valuable, to tell people about it, pass on the invitations. If you haven't already done so, subscribe to our newsletter on the website, and look forward to seeing you next week. With that, I shall call the webinar to a close. Thank you and goodbye.